Hello and welcome to my presentation for Music Honours. My name is Zachary Horne and we'll be looking at my project, which is titled Looking Back, Facing Forward, an exploration of the Australian folk song in the jazz idiom. We start with my thesis question: what are the affordances of Australian colonial folk music when merged into a contemporary jazz context? And how am I going to find this out? It is through my creative work, which is arranging, recording and performing 5 Australian folk songs in a jazz context, the style being post-bop, it being guitar-centred and a tentet with horns. The 2 photos pictured is how Australian folk music was originally presented. John Meredith on the button harp, and then on your right you will see the titular Australian band 10-part invention, which is the inspiration for my band layout and arranging. I thought I would include a quick disambiguation of terms to ensure my research is completely clear. Australian colonial folk is a term out of necessity. This was done to separate my selected pieces from later practitioners which could also be labelled folk, such as Slim Dusty, all the way to modern players such as Brad Cox. Contemporary jazz is a vague concept, so I've elected to define my style as post-bop, which combines elements of hard bop, modal jazz, avant-garde and free jazz. It's also the most common style that you will see be practiced in the jazz idiom today. I will use my definition adapted from Gibson in 1979 to define my concept of affordances. The affordances of colonial folk music are what it offers the musicological, compositional and stylistic framework of contemporary jazz. What it provides and furnishes, either for good or for ill. And guitar-centered tentet refers to the ensemble, being myself, a guitarist, surrounded by 4 saxes, all of which are doubling on flutes, clarinet or bass clarinet, trumpets doubling on flugelhorns, trombone, upright bass, and drums. In my preliminary research, I've been able to discover what is already out there in this area, as well as what is really lacking. I've chosen for this presentation to separate my findings into 5 distinct areas, and I'll be highlighting what different aspects each of these areas bring to the table. We start with the stylistic definition books. Meredith and Anderson were both the leading figures in the preservation of Australian folk tradition and very celebrated folklorists. Each of them recorded and notated pieces from the tradition, as well as explored their origins through taking first-hand accounts from those who had these songs handed down to them through the generations. In the middle of the slide we have John Shan's book on the Australian accent and jazz. Shan really attempts to define what Australian jazz is through contextualizing it through our most impactful musicians over the decades and how it is separate from traditions such as the American and European traditions. This is really important, the contextualization of my own approach and musical biases, as well as trying to define what this music's place is, not only in jazz in general, but also jazz in the Australian context. On the far right, we have at the top Sammy Nestico's book. Sammy Nestico sadly passed away. He was one of the greatest composers, arrangers in jazz, being the principal arranger for Count Basie Big Band at the height of their fame. His book, The Complete Arranger, is highly celebrated and has served me greatly in the nuts and bolts of arranging for a 10-piece band. Finally, Berkeley-style analysis, or chord scale theory as it's commonly known, has been one of the leading forms of analysis in jazz since its introduction in the 1970s. The Berkeley Book of Jazz Harmony by Mulholland and Hodgenacki is the most up-to-date version of this theory. This book identifies my style of analysis and approach and really gives the reader some context into how I will be discussing musical concepts. Next, we have first-hand accounts from musicians through interviews. Downbeat magazine has been one of, if not the leading periodical in jazz music since its first publication in 1934. The book you see there is a compilation of the best interviews from the first 75 years of its publication. I'll give you a moment just to read those 2 quotes there. That is Jelly Roll Morton, who is credited as the inventor of jazz, and Bill Frisell, one of the leading jazz guitarists in the world today, talking about the same thing 72 years apart. When I found this, I knew I was on the right path. Third is arguably the most important part of this research, the music. Here are 9 albums labelled as jazz from all over the world that use folk compositions and or folk elements in the music. The top three use different compositions from North America: Sonny Rollins from 1957, Frizzell and John Schofield from the 2010s. Lionel Luecki, a guitarist from Benin, uses West African composition forms as his trademark. Atma Blue is an Australian band featuring names such as Sandy Evans, James Greening, Jeremy Sawkins that use South Indian Carnatic forms as the basis of their entire music. Cogito and his Time Machine uses his homeland's music from Puerto Rico. Niels Henning Ørsted Petersen is a Danish bass player who uses Scandinavian folk songs, specifically Norwegian, in his appropriately named album, Uncharted Land. Gets Gilberto. It's a seminal jazz album from 1964 that features the compositions of Brazilian composer Antonio Carlos Jobim. And finally, Horace Silver plays the music of his motherland, Cape Verde, in his album The Cape Verdean Blues. I wish I could play samples from this music, but this presentation would have to be 150 minutes long, not 15 minutes long. The one thing that is missing is the Australian folk song in jazz. This is the gap that I am hoping to fill. So in place of recordings of Australian folk music, in the jazz context, I've selected a number of notated works that take Australian folk songs and transplant them into other styles. The example I provided here are three versions of the classic Banjo Paterson song, Waltzing Matilda. Ruth McCall writes for choir, being soprano, alto, tenor, baritone and bass, including clapsticks and didgeridoo. Richard Charlton writes for solo guitar, and Judy Bailey, not pictured, writes for jazz big band. The use of these works are twofold. One, they prove the pliability and adaptability of these pieces to be moulded into different contexts, and two, they provide a starting point for my own arranging. Lastly, we have the works from the academic field. These articles and theses examine examples from around the world of the reworking of native folk into jazz and similar styles. I've included in this presentation only some of the most important pieces in my research, as well as a short synopsis that you can look through. They cover English folk rock, the ebb and flow of folk throughout jazz history, Bartok and his impact on folk preservation, Puerto Rican folk jazz, and the emergence of Norwegian folk jazz. And here is a short recap of what we've covered so far, what is out there and what isn't out there, as we've discovered. Next, I'll be going over my methodology and process for this project. The main element for this project's methodology is practice-based research. I've used Candy and Edmonds' definition as I believe it most closely describes how I will be going about my process and also how I will report my findings. There is certainly at least an element of reflexive research in this project. I've been keeping a compositional log since starting the arrangement of these pieces. In it I've included my aesthetic thoughts, higher order harmonic concepts, melodic interpretations, the challenges I have faced, as well as discussions with my supervisor Nathan Scott and consultant Jeremy Borthwick. The final element of my methodology I have tentatively titled reflective analysis. I plan to combine my reflexive work with a post-completion or post-production examination of my artifact. I hope to remove myself, at least to a degree, to analyse the recording and notated works with less bias. I have been working with my supervisor to see if there is a more rigorous academic concept that can describe this. For now, this placeholder name of reflective analysis will have to do. And here is the process that I've been following thus far. We've already touched on the first step of information gathering and dissemination. I've completed the bulk of this, but I will be conducting further information gathering as I go to strengthen my work and as more questions arise. The second step is what I'm currently most focused on. So far I've arranged 3 pieces and I'm currently working on the final 2. We have the recording date slated for the end of the semester break currently, and hopefully we will be able to get it mastered, ready for commercial release alongside the completion of the exegesis. I will be then selecting from those recordings 3 out of 5 of the pieces that best serve my research. After that, I will conduct an in-depth musicological analysis with reference to the score and recordings. This will take up a bulk of the exegesis after my literary review and review practice. And here are the 5 pieces that I've selected: Botany Bay, Click Go the Shears, Flashjack from Gundagai, The Dying Stockman, and Banks of the Condamine. I intentionally chose pieces that were not too obscure and could be familiar to the average punter. I've also listed their arranging style. That's hard bop waltz, so it's something quite funky, soul driven, quite popular in the 60s was hard bop. Click Go the Shears is a ballad, so it'll be full, it'll be slow, it'll be romantic, which is a bit of a departure from its original state, being Click Go the Shears. Flashjack from Gundagai was the original impetus for this project. As far as picking repertoire, it will be very fast bop, and it'll be very similar to what is known as a rhythm changes piece. The Dying Stockman will be a nice easy waltz. I'll be using some of the third stream arranging techniques, such as using flutes, clarinet, bass clarinet, which is not too common in the jazz idiom. And Banks of the Condamine, I am using a petito alto, which is a style from Brazilian jazz, which has been in the lexicon, as we talked about, gets into Gilberto since the 60s. And here we have my arranging process. I've used Dying Stockman as the example for this one, but it is muchly the same with every piece that I've chosen. On the left we start, it is exactly how John Meredith presents it, or Anderson presents it, depending on where I'm sourcing the piece from. In the middle we have what is described as a lead sheet arrangement, that is chords, melody, very simple pieces of arranging such as introduction, endings. And finally on the far right we have a small excerpt from my arrangement for 10 pieces. You'll see harmonized horns, counter lines, a specific bass and drum part, articulations, expressive techniques, all the manner of things. I mentioned in the overview of my process that we're looking at recording at the end of the semester break. We're planning to use the recording studio that's just opening up above the concert hall at the con. Through that process we'll also be using tools such as Pro Tools to mix and master it. I will not be mixing and mastering it myself. I will be acting as the producer, so I will be telling people what to do, and I'll be using the great skills of Nathan Scott, as this is his area of expertise. I've also sought out a person from my local area to mix and master who has much experience working through the Sony label. The framing of my analysis will be through the concepts of music, which is the system that is used in the music syllabus in New South Wales high schools. I have a lot of experience working as a teacher in high schools, and this allows us to market it and make it far more approachable. So possibly later on down the line, this work can be used within high schools as an analysis tool. A compulsory part of music education is Australian music of the last 25 years, and they're always looking for further pieces. But beyond that, pitch, duration, tone, color, texture, expressive techniques, and structure are all very thought out, methodical ways to analyze a piece of music, and this is how I'll be contextualizing my understanding of what these pieces offer and their affordances. Next, I will touch on my tentative conclusions from this research so far. The first notable point I discovered was that these compositions are conducive to the jazz tradition and usable in a standards context. When I say standards repertoire or standards context, I mean the shared tunes that we all play as jazz musicians that you might see at NEMA on a Tuesday night or any little jazz club. This is something that has been done throughout the United States with their folk tunes. I believe absolutely these tunes are conducive to that. The compositions from this style present a variety of musicological affordances. Already I am seeing through my arranging that there is going to be a lot of affordances that are seen. However, there are limitations what can be done in the jazz idiom while still staying faithful. It's important that I say still staying faithful, because a key part of this project is I wanted to present the pieces in as minimal of a changed way. I didn't want a Frankenstein's monster. I wanted to make sure these pieces were still recognizable and still viewable as they are as they were when they first were recorded or played or passed down through the tradition in Federation and pre-Federation. Already I know this creative work in exegesis is only scratching the surface as what is out there. I'm looking at a very limited style of jazz, and I'm also looking at a very limited sample size. I truly believe that this will reach far beyond just the confines of an honest project. Thank you very much for your time. I hope this has helped provide greater context to my project, and also it has helped inspire a bit of excitement for what is to come. Thank you very much.